Just a few words about TNE. TNE is an NGO. It's a very active organization. It is very much in favor of a cleaner environment. Can you give us...
What does, according to you, a green recovery for transport look like?
Hi. Thanks. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the discussion so far. So what's a green recovery for aviation? Well, Transport and Environment, we're a Brussels-based organisation that works on sustainable transport. So we see what's happening in other transport modes as well. What's happening, for example, in the car sector. And also we're members of the International Coalition for Sustainable Aviation. So we follow developments globally around reducing the climate impact of aviation. And that puts us in a pretty good position to look both at what other transport modes are doing and also what's happening globally with aviation, because it is a global sector and there's a lot we can learn. I think the question is, what does a green recovery look like for aviation? Well, a green recovery for aviation looks very much like a green recovery for any other part of the economy. It's a recovery where that sector burns less fossil fuels. You know, a lot of time we talk about aviation, we talk about making things more efficient, we talk about new aircraft designs, maybe in 15 years' time. But ultimately, a green recovery now means that from now onwards, we start burning fewer and fewer fossil fuels. And for aviation, that's got to mean finding something other than fossil kerosene. There are a lot of developments around the world, a lot of them in Europe, but other jurisdictions as well, working on that. It does mean flying less, because for so long as aviation is reliant on fossil kerosene, flying less is the best way to reduce the climate impact of aviation. And I think, you know, my expertise is mostly in Europe. I think there is scope in Europe to reduce the amount of flying we do and still have a successful aviation industry and still have an aviation industry which recovers. I don't believe those two are mutually compatible. So developing those new technologies and also understanding, you know, how and why we need to fly, I think are important elements in ensuring a green recovery.
We're going to develop on that a little bit later on, but my second question for you, Andrew, what role the mobility system should play in increasing new climate ambitions, according to you?
Well, each mobility mode has to charge its own path. Each are different, each have their own challenge. I think the aviation sector needs to look at what its best options are. And one great thing about the aviation sector is we do have a certain level of certainty in what the sector is going to look like. We know that new aircraft aren't going to arrive anytime soon. We're going to continue to produce traditional jet engines for quite some time. So we know we're going to have a huge demand for a drop in fuel which can be put into those aircraft. And that means aviation's path to decarbonization is to some extent known in advance. We need something which looks like kerosene, but doesn't harm the planet in the way that fossil kerosene, fossil jet fuel does. That's going to be aviation's primary path to decarbonization. But related to this, because the technology itself is important to identify, but the role of regulators, the role of government is also very, very important. And if there's one big lesson from the aviation sector, at least here in Europe, to take away from this is, prior to the crisis, we heard a lot about how the aviation sector is a global sector, it's international, and therefore needs to have international climate rules, such as being developed by ICAO. And so you heard that a lot from European airlines. When the COVID crisis struck, all of a sudden these global international airlines, which wanted international solutions, very quickly came looking for national bailouts. And that changes the political dynamic here in Europe, because it's no longer acceptable for an airline to call itself international when it comes to climate policy, and then national when it wants to get bailed out by its government. So as we recover from this crisis, we're going to see, an understanding that airlines, if they're reliant on the states for financial aid during crises like this, they also have to follow national climate ambitions and national climate targets in the years to come.
Last but not least, before we hear the other speakers, Andrew, are you in favor of an airline transport decrease to address the global warming issue, and by what means?
I think yes. The reality is, unlike other transport modes, for example, the road transport sector, we're getting increased electrification. There aren't technologies available tomorrow for aviation. Any technology is going to have a 10-year gap before it can be scaled up. So for the next decade, reducing the amount of flying we do in those parts of the world where we have quite heavy footprints is something to be considered. And I think large companies who do a lot of corporate travel, I think they should lead by example, and they should reduce the amount of corporate travel they do. We've learned from this crisis we can get by with far less flying, a lot more Zooms, a lot more conferences like this. We should continue that until aviation has more decarbonisation technologies available. If we'd started aviation's decarbonisation pathway 10, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have to have this conversation around demand management. But because we're so late to starting aviation's decarbonisation agenda, unfortunately, for the next decade, if you want to reduce the emissions from flying, you have to fly less.
Thank you, Andrew. You stay with us, of course.